In the spring of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy stood at the pinnacle of its power. 6 months had passed since the devastating strike on Pearl Harbor, and Japanese forces had swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave, conquering territory after territory with seemingly unstoppable momentum. The carriers of the combined fleet, those magnificent warships that had brought America to its knees on December 7, 1941, remained the most feared naval weapons in the world. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Japan's Pacific strategy, believed his fleet was invincible, operating with complete freedom across the vast ocean. But beneath this veneer of confidence, a catastrophic vulnerability was about to be exposed, one that would change the course of the entire war. The Japanese High Command had no idea that thousands of miles away, in a basement facility at Pearl Harbor, a small team of American cryptanalysts was performing what would become one of the most consequential intelligence operations in military history. These men, working in a unit known as Station Hypo, were doing something the Japanese believed impossible. They were reading Japan's most secret naval communications. Every day, every hour, Japanese radio operators transmitted encoded messages across the Pacific, coordinating fleet movements, planning operations, and discussing strategy. They did so with complete confidence that their codes were unbreakable. They were wrong. The Americans had been working on Japanese naval codes since before the war began, but progress had been agonizingly slow. The Japanese Navy's General Purpose Code, known to the Americans as JN-25, was incredibly complex, featuring thousands of 5-digit groups that could represent words, phrases, or even individual syllables. Breaking such a code required not just mathematical skill, but also an intimate understanding of Japanese language, culture, and military terminology. Station Hypo, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, brought together some of the most brilliant minds in cryptanalysis, linguists who had studied Japanese for years, and radio operators who could distinguish between different Japanese transmission patterns. Before we continue with this incredible story of intelligence and counterintelligence, I want to ask you to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the most fascinating untold stories from World War II, and your support helps us continue creating this content. Also, drop a comment below telling us what you think about this story. Now let's get back to 1942, when the Japanese Navy was about to receive the shock of their lives. By March 1942, the cryptanalysts at Station Hypo had achieved a breakthrough. They had broken enough of the JN-25 code to begin reading portions of Japanese messages. It was painstaking work, requiring the analysis of hundreds of intercepted transmissions, looking for patterns, repeated phrases, and contextual clues. The Intelligence Center in Melbourne, Australia, was also working on Japanese codes, and together these facilities were beginning to piece together Japan's operational plans. They weren't reading every message completely, but they were getting enough information to predict Japanese movements with remarkable accuracy. The first test of this intelligence capability came in early May 1942, during what would become known as the Battle of the Coral Sea. Through intercepted communications, the Americans learned that the Japanese were planning an operation to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, used this intelligence to position American carriers in the area. The resulting battle, which took place from May 4th through May 8th, was the first naval engagement in history where the opposing ships never sighted each other directly. All the fighting was done by aircraft launched from carriers. While the Americans lost more ships in the tactical sense, they achieved a strategic victory by stopping the Japanese advance toward Port Moresby. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that American intelligence was providing actionable information about Japanese operations. But the Japanese didn't realize what was happening. They attributed their encounter with American carriers to coincidence or perhaps to normal patrol patterns. They had no idea that their most secret communications were being read in Pearl Harbor. This dangerous ignorance was about to lead them into a trap that would destroy the elite of their carrier fleet. In mid-April 1942, Admiral Yamamoto finalized plans for his most ambitious operation yet. He would strike at Midway Atoll, a small group of islands roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway was strategically important, serving as an American outpost in the Central Pacific, but Yamamoto's real goal wasn't the capture of these insignificant islands. His objective was to lure the American carriers into a decisive battle where he could destroy them. With America's carriers eliminated, Japan would have at least a year, perhaps longer, to consolidate its conquests and build an impregnable defensive perimeter across the Pacific. The attack was scheduled for early June. The Doolittle raid on April 18th, when American bombers launched from the carrier, Hornet struck Tokyo and other Japanese cities, reinforced Yamamoto's determination to proceed with the Midway operation. Although the raid caused minimal physical damage, it was a profound psychological shock to the Japanese, demonstrating that their home islands were vulnerable to attack. The need for an extended defensive perimeter seemed more urgent than ever. On May 5th, Imperial General Headquarters issued Navy Order No. 18, officially directing Yamamoto to occupy Midway and key points in the western Aleutians. The plan for Operation MI, as the Midway attack was designated, was extraordinarily complex, typical of Japanese naval planning during this period. Multiple battle groups would operate across hundreds of miles of ocean, requiring precise coordination and timing. Yamamoto would personally command from the battleship Yamato, positioned well behind the carrier striking force. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, would command the carrier force, which included 4 of Japan's finest carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same ships that had devastated Pearl Harbor, and they carried the most experienced naval aviators in the world. A separate force would attack the Aleutian Islands to the north, serving both as a diversion and to extend Japan's defensive perimeter. Transport ships carrying invasion troops would approach Midway from the southwest, ready to land once Nagumo's carriers had neutralized American air power on the islands. Japanese intelligence estimated that only 2 American carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, were available to oppose them. They believed the carrier Yorktown had been severely damaged or destroyed at the Coral Sea and couldn't possibly participate in any operation for months. They also assumed that the Americans had no idea the attack was coming and would be caught by surprise. Both assumptions were catastrophically wrong. At Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, Commander Rochefort and his team were working around the clock, intercepting and analyzing Japanese communications about the upcoming operation. They knew something big was being planned, but the Japanese messages referred to the target only as AF. Where was AF? Different analysts suggested different locations. Some thought it might be Hawaii itself. Others suggested locations in the South Pacific or the Aleutians. The stakes were enormous. If Nimitz positioned his carriers in the wrong location, they would miss the battle entirely, and the Japanese would achieve their objectives unopposed. Rochefort believed AF was Midway, but he needed proof. In one of the most clever deceptions in intelligence history, he devised a simple test. He arranged for the garrison on Midway to send an uncoded radio message reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down and they were running short of fresh water. This message was transmitted in a way that the Japanese would certainly intercept it. Then Rochefort waited. Within days, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF is short of water. The trap had worked perfectly. AF was definitely Midway. But the intelligence breakthrough went even further. The cryptanalysts at Hypo discovered the date cipher being used in Japanese messages, which meant they could determine exactly when the attack would occur. After analyzing the intercepts, Rochefort predicted the attack would come on June 4th, 1942. He even provided estimates of the composition of the Japanese force, 4 or 5 carriers, approximately 200 aircraft, plus supporting battleships and cruisers. Admiral Nimitz had something no commander could normally hope for: detailed advanced knowledge of enemy plans, strength, and timing. Nimitz used this intelligence brilliantly. He rushed repairs on the Yorktown, which had indeed been damaged at Coral Sea, but was not as badly hurt as the Japanese believed. In an incredible feat of engineering, Pearl Harbor shipyard workers completed repairs estimated to require 3 months in just 3 days. Yorktown put to sea and joined Enterprise and Hornet northeast of Midway. The Americans would have 3 carriers to face the Japanese 4. More importantly, they would be waiting in ambush, positioned where the Japanese didn't expect them. Nimitz also reinforced Midway's defenses, flying in additional aircraft and positioning submarines along the expected Japanese approach routes. Every advantage was being pressed. The Americans were reading Japanese mail, and the Japanese had no idea. Ironically, the Japanese had their own radio intelligence capabilities, and they were actually quite good. Japanese monitoring stations had been tracking American radio communications for months. They had identified call signs for individual ships and shore stations. Through traffic analysis, examining the volume and patterns of radio transmissions, they could often determine when carriers were at sea or in port. Radio traffic between aircraft and ground stations would increase when a carrier was in port and its planes were operating from shore bases, then decrease when the carrier put to sea with its aircraft aboard. In the days before the Midway operation, Japanese radio intelligence officers noted some disturbing signs. There was increased urgent message traffic coming out of Pearl Harbor. Traffic analysis suggested that at least 1, possibly more, American task forces had put to sea. This was exactly the kind of information that should have prompted a reassessment of the operation. If American carriers were at sea and alerted, the fundamental premise of the Midway plan, catching the Americans by surprise, was compromised. But here the Japanese made a fatal mistake, one rooted in their own operational doctrine and command culture. Admiral Yamamoto had imposed strict radio silence on his fleet once it departed Japan. This was standard practice, intended to prevent the Americans from detecting the Japanese force through radio direction finding. But Yamamoto extended this doctrine to incoming communications as well. He didn't want any radio transmissions to or from his ships that might give away their position. As a result, the critical intelligence about American carrier movements was never transmitted to Vice Admiral Nagumo's carrier striking force. The men who most needed this information never received it. So the Japanese fleet steamed toward Midway in complete confidence, believing they had achieved surprise, unaware that the Americans were reading their plans and waiting for them. The Japanese had excellent intelligence officers, sophisticated monitoring equipment, and they had actually detected American preparations. But institutional rigidity and flawed command decisions meant this intelligence was never used. It was one of the most consequential intelligence failures in naval history. The morning of June 4, 1942, dawned clear and calm over Midway. At approximately 4:30 a.m., Nagumo launched the first wave of his attack over 100 aircraft heading toward the atoll. The Japanese had sent scout planes in various directions to search for American ships, but these searches were inadequate. Nagumo had only 7 scout aircraft available, while the Americans had over 30 patrol planes in the air. Moreover, one of the Japanese scouts, the one covering the sector where the American carriers were actually located, launched 30 minutes late due to catapult problems. That delay would have devastating consequences. American patrol planes sighted the Japanese carriers at approximately 5:30 a.m. and radioed their position. The Americans now knew exactly where their enemy was. Meanwhile, Japanese aircraft struck Midway, attacking airfields and installations. The American planes based on Midway, outmatched by the superior Japanese fighters, suffered terrible losses. But they had accomplished their mission. They had located and reported the enemy carriers. Admiral Fletcher, commanding the American carrier force from Yorktown, made the critical decision. He ordered strikes launched against the Japanese carriers immediately, even though this meant his aircraft would be attacking at the extreme limit of their range. Every minute counted. The Americans had to hit the Japanese carriers while they were vulnerable before they could locate and strike the American fleet. At 7:28 a.m., disaster struck the Japanese from an unexpected direction. The scout plane that had launched late finally reported sighting what appeared to be American ships, including what might be a carrier, exactly where the Japanese had not expected to find them. Nagumo was caught in a terrible dilemma. His first attack wave was returning from Midway, low on fuel and ammunition, needing to land immediately. His second wave aircraft were on the carrier decks armed with bombs for attacking land targets, the wrong weapons for attacking ships. He needed torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for a carrier strike. Should he land the returning aircraft first, then rearm the second wave for a ship attack? Or should he launch immediately with the wrong weapons? Nagumo made a decision that seemed reasonable at the moment but would prove catastrophic. He ordered the second wave aircraft taken below to the hangar decks to be rearmed with the proper weapons for a ship attack. Meanwhile, he would recover the returning strike force. It would take time, but then he would be able to launch a properly equipped strike against the American carriers. What Nagumo didn't know was that American carrier aircraft were already on their way, and time was the one thing he didn't have. The American attack began just after 10 a.m., and initially it was a disaster. Torpedo bombers from all three American carriers attacked the Japanese fleet, and they were slaughtered. The slow, obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers were easy targets for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, only 6 survived, and not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. It appeared to be a complete failure. But those torpedo attacks, costly as they were, had drawn the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the high altitude undefended. And at that exact moment, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet. The carriers were in the worst possible condition, their decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, fuel lines open, ammunition scattered about, bombs and torpedoes sitting exposed. The dive bombers, unopposed by fighters, had perfect targets. In the span of approximately 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were transformed into burning wrecks. American bombs smashed through their flight decks into the hangar decks below, where they ignited fuel, ammunition, and aircraft. Secondary explosions ripped through the ships as torpedoes and bombs cooked off in the fires. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, escaped this initial attack because it was separated from the others, but it too would be located and destroyed later that afternoon. For the Japanese, the battle was an unbelievable catastrophe. In one day, they lost 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable complement of highly trained pilots and aircrew. These were the same carriers and many of the same men who had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The backbone of Japan's naval air power was broken. The Americans lost the Yorktown, sunk by a Japanese submarine, days after the battle, but they had achieved a decisive strategic victory. In the aftermath of Midway, as Japanese survivors were rescued and the remnants of the fleet limped back to Japan, the terrible truth began to emerge. The Americans had been waiting for them. The ambush had been too perfect, the American positioning too precise to be coincidental. Japanese intelligence officers began piecing together what had happened. The Americans had known they were coming. They had known the target, the timing, the composition of the force, everything. The realization was shattering. Japan's most secret communications had been compromised. The codes they had believed unbreakable had been broken. The Americans had been reading their messages for months. Every operation, every movement, every plan had potentially been exposed to enemy eyes. And the intelligence that Japanese stations had gathered, warning of American carrier movements before the battle, had been available but never transmitted to the fleet due to radio silence procedures. The Japanese Navy had been defeated not just by American bombs, but by their own failures in intelligence, communication, and operational security. The discovery that their fleet movements were known prompted a major change in Japanese naval communication security. They revised their codes, tightened procedures, and increased their own radio intelligence efforts, but the damage was done. The cryptanalysts at Station Hypo and other Allied intelligence centers had demonstrated their capabilities, and while the Japanese made their codes more difficult, the Allied code breakers continued to make progress throughout the war. The intelligence advantage gained in 1942 would continue to pay dividends in battles to come. The story of how the Japanese discovered their communications were compromised is also a story of missed opportunities and institutional failure. They had the capability to detect American preparations. Their radio intelligence was sophisticated enough to provide warning, but command rigidity, inadequate procedures for disseminating intelligence, and overconfidence in their own security prevented them from acting on the information they had. Meanwhile, the Americans, despite having fewer resources and breaking into Japanese codes later than the Japanese had been monitoring American communications, used their intelligence more effectively, integrated it into operational planning, and achieved the decisive victory at Midway. For Admiral Yamamoto, the defeat at Midway was a personal disaster. He had staked Japan's Pacific strategy on destroying American carrier power and had instead lost his own carriers. He had planned an operation of extraordinary complexity that required perfect coordination and surprise, but the Americans had known every detail in advance. In the year that followed, Yamamoto would continue to command the combined fleet, but he would never recover the offensive capability lost at Midway. In April 1943, American intelligence would intercept and decode a message revealing Yamamoto's travel plans for an inspection tour. American fighters ambushed his aircraft over Bougainville and ended his life, another demonstration of how thoroughly American intelligence had penetrated Japanese communications. The Battle of Midway is often called the turning point of the Pacific War, and rightly so. But it was a turning point achieved not just through courage and skill, though American pilots displayed both in abundance but through intelligence. The cryptanalysts of Station Hypo, working in their basement facility in Pearl Harbor, men whose names were unknown to the public and whose work remained classified for years after the war, achieved a victory as important as any won on the battlefield. They proved that information is power, that knowing your enemy's plans is worth more than any number of ships or aircraft. For the Japanese Navy, the discovery that their movements were known came too late to prevent disaster at Midway, but it taught lessons that would influence their operations for the rest of the war. They became more cautious, more suspicious, more aware that the Americans might be reading their mail. But they could never completely secure their communications, and the Americans, having tasted the fruits of successful intelligence, would continue to exploit every advantage they could gain. The events of 1942, when the Japanese Navy discovered their fleet movements were known, represent one of the most dramatic intelligence stories of World War II. It's a story of brilliant cryptanalysis and foolish overconfidence, of warnings ignored and opportunities seized, of how information can be more valuable than weapons. The Americans read Japanese codes and won the Battle of Midway. The Japanese discovered their communications were compromised, but only after suffering one of the most decisive defeats in naval history. In the cruel mathematics of war, that difference in timing changed everything. Today, historians recognize that Midway might have turned out very differently if the Japanese had better security, if they had taken their own intelligence warnings seriously, or if the Americans hadn't broken JN-25. The battle was decided not just in the skies over the Pacific, but in the basement offices where cryptanalysts worked with intercepts and codebooks. It was a new kind of warfare, one where information was as important as firepower, and the side that could see through the fog of war had an almost insurmountable advantage. The story of 1942 reminds us that wars are won not just by those with the most powerful weapons, but by those who use all available tools most effectively. Intelligence, when properly gathered and intelligently used, can be decisive. The Japanese Navy learned this lesson the hard way at Midway. By the time they discovered their fleet movements were known, 4 carriers lay at the bottom of the Pacific, and the course of the war had changed forever.